I still remember that morning with an almost uncanny clarity, as though each moment were etched into my memory in high definition. It was early June 1991 in Indianapolis, and the summer sun had just begun to warm the tarmac outside the airport terminal. I stood at the luggage carousel, fumbling with my boarding pass and my husband's oversized suitcase, already feeling the familiar flutter of nerves that always accompanied a flight. My in-laws, seated nearby on those rigid plastic chairs, were watching me with amused expressions. "Relax, honey," my mother-in-law said, leaning forward and patting my shoulder. "You've done this 1,000 times." I smiled wanly, not because I felt calm, but because I wanted to appear so. My father-in-law, Harold, chuckled and shook his head. "You miss one flight, and you'll see how they treat you. Next thing, you're sleeping with the other sorry souls at the airport hotel." Their laughter was gentle, playful teasing between family members. But as I slipped my hand into my carry-on, I felt a sudden jolt of panic. My ticket. I rifled through the folder, breath catching in my throat. The ticket wasn't there. I patted down the smooth leather of my purse, emptied its pockets. No ticket. My heartbeat thundered in my chest. "Everything all right?" my husband Mark asked as he approached, coffee in hand. I can't find my boarding pass," I stammered, voice barely above a whisper. My in-laws exchanged amused glances once more. "Don't worry," Mark said calmly, wrapping an arm around me. "You'll probably just left it at the check-in counter. I'll go see if they can print you a new one." I handed him the purse, my hands trembling. As he walked away, my mother-in-law leaned closer. "You sure you packed everything? Did you have it this morning when we left the house?" "Yes," I lied, the lie tumbling out of my mouth before my mind could stop it. "I had it in my hand as we drove here. I remembered it so clearly. But the ticket, and with it, certainty, was gone." Mark returned 20 minutes later without success. The agent shook her head apologetically. "I'm sorry, Mom. The flight's already closed. We can't reissue the boarding pass." My stomach dropped. I pictured the airplane pulling away from the gate, taking off for Dallas without me. I pictured it soaring into the clear blue sky, my in-laws' laughter echoing in the car as I sat sulking at home. I could almost hear their jeers. "See, you're not invincible." I fought the tears that threatened to spill down my cheeks. Mark squeezed my hand. "I'm sorry, babe. I'll try to get you on the next one." My father-in-law huffed theatrically. "Well, while you're waiting, don't forget to pack a lunch for the bus ride to school tomorrow." He winked at his wife, and they both burst into laughter, the kind of laughter that's warm and unthreatening, if bewildering in its timing. I laughed too, but it felt hollow. Later that afternoon, I sat on a bench in the deserted gate area, tracing the seam of my jeans with my fingernail. The terminal had emptied out. Most passengers bound for Dallas had already boarded. I watched the cockpit doors close, the jet bridge retract, and the engines roar to life. Then the flight pushed back, taxied to the runway, and disappeared into the distance. I felt a pang of remorse, not just for missing the flight, but that I had let my family's teasing get under my skin. My phone buzzed with a news alert I barely registered. Breaking. Flight 845 en route to Dallas reported missing. Emergency declared. My heart lurched. I tapped the notification, but the screen froze. A line of stranded passengers watched the screens helplessly. No further details. The only thing I could think was, my flight. Flight 845. It hit home like a sledgehammer. That was the flight I'd missed. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Then, at 6:42 p.m., the airport intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, we regret to inform you that Flight 845, which departed at 3:20 this afternoon, experienced catastrophic engine failure approximately 40 minutes after takeoff. The last communication with the aircraft indicated an uncontrolled descent near Little Rock. Search and rescue teams are en route to the crash site." My breath caught. My in-laws fell silent, their faces paling as they stared at me. In that moment, the teasing laughter they directed at me that morning felt like a cruel echo. Guilt and relief waged a furious battle in my chest. Guilt that I had been annoyed by their laughter. Relief that I hadn't been on that airplane. Harold reached out and took my hand. His eyes glistened. "We're just glad you're okay," he whispered. My mother-in-law wrapped her arms around me. "We love you," she murmured. "We didn't know. We didn't. I'm so sorry." In that moment, everything changed. The playful jokes evaporated, replaced by tears and trembling voices. My flight was gone. So were 300 souls, families torn apart, futures erased in an instant. And I was still here, trembling on that cold bench in an empty terminal. As the night sky settled over Indianapolis, I stared at the flickering departure board and wondered, how do you move forward when the world has tipped off its axis? How do you face the in-laws who laughed one minute and wept the next? How do you hold on to hope when tragedy has claimed so many lives and you almost joined them? Nothing would ever be the same again. The chapel was a modest brick building set back from the dusty highway leading into Little Rock, Arkansas. Inside, the pews were filled with families draped in black, some clutching each other like shipwrecked sailors, desperate for warmth. I arrived late that evening, having driven through a haze of tears, guilt, and disbelief. My in-laws were already there. Harold seated rigidly in the front row, his back ramrod straight, eyes fixed on the small wooden pulpit. My mother-in-law, Eleanor, sat beside him, her face pale and drawn, her hands entwined in her lap as though to still them from trembling. I slipped into the empty pew directly behind them, feeling suddenly intrusive, like an echo in a room too small for noise. As the service began, the pastor's voice was steady, measured, yet unmistakably burdened by sorrow. "We gather today not only to mourn those we have lost, but also to bear witness to the fragility of life." Each word landed like a pebble in my chest. I bowed my head, picturing the 287 passengers who had boarded Flight 845, each with their own stories, dreams, and loved ones waiting at the far end of that flight path. After the brief eulogy, photographs were displayed on a folding table. Smiling families on vacation, children clutching teddy bears, business travelers deep in thought. One photo caught my eye, a young couple standing on a Parisian balcony, arms around each other, glasses of champagne raised in a silent toast. Both looked radiant with promise. I didn't know their names, but I recognized their hope. I recognized the world that had been taken from them. When the service ended, the room fell into a hush that felt heavier than the afternoon heat. One by one, families rose and filed past the photos, placing single white roses in front of each frame. I followed, my legs carrying me forward almost involuntarily. My hand hovered over the cool petals of the rose I'd chosen before I felt the soft drop of a second flower in my palm. I looked up. Eleanor's eyes were glistening. I couldn't bear to leave you alone," she managed, voice cracking. Her silhouette, once so familiar and playful, now seemed fragile, almost transparent. I nodded, tears blurring my vision. "Thank you." For a long moment we stood side by side, sharing silence that spoke more than any words ever could. The chapel doors remained open to the night sky, and a gentle breeze drifted in, carrying with it the distant sound of cicadas singing their ceaseless lament. Later, outside under a street lamp's dim glow, Harold approached me. His frame, always so sturdy, looked smaller in the open air. He handed me a photograph he had taken earlier that day of the terminal bench where I'd sat, the place where my laughter, or rather my family's laughter at my expense, had turned into my salvation. "I want you to have this," he said quietly, "so you remember how close you were." I took the photo with trembling hands. It showed an empty bench bathed in late afternoon sunlight, the digital timestamp clear in the corner. June 12th, 1991, 5:12 p.m. Exactly 8 minutes before the flight was scheduled to depart. "Hold on to it," he continued. "Not as a reminder of what you missed, but of what you've been spared." That night, I couldn't sleep. Lying in the guest room at my in-laws' house, I stared at the ceiling, replaying my final moments at the gate. The laughter, The mild annoyance I felt at being teased, the crushing disappointment of missing the flight. I wondered how easily humanity's humor could slip into cruelty without intention, how quickly a family squabble could become a blessing in disguise. And most of all, I wondered how I would carry this truth forward without it becoming a burden heavier than the grief already suffocating so many. By dawn, the families had dispersed, some back to their quiet homes in Texas, others bound for Denver or Chicago to return to lives forever shifted by loss. I watched them go, feeling both gratitude and grief entwined in my chest. My in-laws climbed into their car to head back to Indianapolis. I would accompany them part way before turning toward home. As we drove in silence, the radio crackled with news bulletins, and each mention of Flight 845's passenger manifest was a fresh stab in my heart. When we reached the state line, Harold pulled the car to the shoulder. He turned to me, his eyes serious. "We're proud of you," he said, "for surviving, though I hate calling it that. It sounds wrong. But we're proud you're still here." I pressed the photo of the bench between my fingers and nodded. In that instant, I understood that surviving was not a gift you asked for. It was a responsibility you bore. A responsibility to live fully, because so many would never have that chance. As the sun rose over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of amber and rose, I promised myself I would honor the memory of those lost by telling their stories, by living in gratitude, and by letting this narrow escape transform the way I saw every moment henceforth. The darkness settled over Indianapolis like a heavy curtain as I stepped through the front door of my own home for the first time since the crash. The silence inside was almost deafening. No breakfast chatter, no luggage wheels clicking against the tile, just the faint hum of the refrigerator. I set the photograph of the terminal bench on the hallway console, its glass catching the glow of the entryway light and casting a small, sharp reflection on the wall. I paused there for a moment, hand hovering above the frame. The image held a quiet testimony to luck, timing, and the thin line between life and death. Yet the proof of my survival felt hollow without the sound of my in-laws' laughter, without the messy comfort of family around me. Would I ever feel at home again in this place of routine and familiarity? Inside the living room, Mark's shoes lay abandoned by the door, and I heard him stirring in the bedroom. He emerged minutes later in worn jeans and a t-shirt, eyes shadowed with the same exhaustion that clouded my own. He crossed the room and folded me into his arms. "I missed you," he whispered. His voice cracked, and I felt a fresh wave of grief and relief crash over me. In the days that followed, I drifted through our shared space like a specter. The coffee machine beguiled me with its promise of normalcy, but I could barely lift a cup. The email inbox overflowed with messages from friends who had watched the news and assumed the worst, their words of condolence and relief blurring together. How could I respond? How could I say thank you for fearing I was dead? Sleep came in fitful fragments. Each night I lay awake listening for phantom engine roars, heart pounding against my ribs until I bolted upright, drenched in sweat. In the darkness, I replayed the moment the terminal screen went dark, the moment Flight 845 communicated its final altitude. I imagined the cabin filling with smoke, the anguished screams of the flight crew, the blur of the ground rushing up in an uncontrolled descent. Mark suggested I see a counselor. At first I resisted. Why admit weakness when I had been spared? But on a Wednesday afternoon, with tears leaking unbidden as I sorted laundry, I realized I couldn't hold this weight alone. I made an appointment with Dr. Salazar, a gentle woman with salt and pepper hair and kind brown eyes. In our first session, she handed me a small wooden box, its lid carved with a tree, whose branches intertwined like the roots of grief and hope. "Whenever you feel overwhelmed," she said softly, "write the thoughts down and place them in the box. You don't have to read them again. Just giving them form can lessen their power." That night, I sat at the kitchen table with a pen and a pile of index cards. My hand trembled as I wrote, "I should have died. I don't deserve to be alive. On another card, I'm angry that they're gone. Each confession felt like a stone I placed in the box. By the time I finished, the box was heavy and my chest felt strangely lighter. In the weeks that followed, I attended therapy twice a week. I learned to name my survivor's guilt, to anchor my nightmares with breathing exercises, and to start envisioning a future where my escape had meaning. One afternoon, Dr. Salazar asked if I would consider speaking at a memorial service in Little Rock on the anniversary of the crash. My stomach lurched. Public speaking was a terror I had never faced. But she reminded me that sharing my story might honor the memories of those who didn't return. I said yes. Preparing the speech forced me to confront emotions I had kept buried. I scoured letters from friends, printed news clippings, and pored over the passenger manifest. I learned that Flight 845 carried a firefighter headed to a training conference, a family of 4 returning from their dream vacation, a chef flying in to host a charity dinner, and an elderly couple on their 50th wedding anniversary trip. Each name became a person I knew by heart. On the night of the memorial, the chapel was full again, but this time with open faces rather than anguished stares. I stood at the lectern, hands clasped, as I drew a steadying breath. The wooden box was on the table beside me. As I began to speak, my voice quivered, but I found strength in each word, gratitude for the chance to live, sorrow for the lives ended too soon, and a promise to carry their stories forward. When I finished, the room was silent for a heartbeat, then rose in applause that felt like both an acknowledgement of loss and a celebration of life. Tears blurred my vision again, but these felt different, less like panic, more like release. Driving home that night, I realized that healing wasn't about forgetting or moving on. It was about carrying each memory alongside my own, weaving them into a new tapestry of purpose. The bench photograph lay in the back seat, illuminated by passing street lamps, a reminder of how close I came to being among those I'd vowed to remember. As I slipped the key into the front door and stepped inside, I felt the house greet me not as a stranger, but as someone who had walked through darkness and emerged on the other side with a story to tell. The first time I stepped back into my office at the architectural firm, I was struck by how unchanged everything seemed. The polished mahogany desk gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and the model of the skyline I'd been working on before the crash stood untouched on a corner table. Yet for me, time had fractured. The morning rush that once felt invigorating now felt oppressive. Every elevator ding, every ringing phone felt like a summons back to reality, back to a life I almost abandoned. I hovered by the door for a moment, taking in the quiet hum of colleagues typing and the dull rumble of the HVAC system. My assistant, Lisa, looked up from her computer and smiled warmly, relief evident in her eyes. "It's so good to have you back," she whispered, her voice catching. "Thanks," I managed, forcing a brief smile. The words felt foreign on my tongue, heavy with implication. Back. Back from what? Back to work, back to normalcy, back into the world that had carried on without me on that fateful afternoon. I settled into my chair and spent the next hour poring over blueprints, trying to anchor myself in routine. But each straight line on the page felt sharp and brittle under my pen. I found myself glancing at the clock every few minutes, waiting for the day to end, waiting for the moment when I could slip back to the solace of home. That evening, as dusk settled into the sky, I drove out to the rural property my husband and I had been renovating before the accident. It was a small farmhouse nestled among rolling cornfields, a place we'd imagined as our refuge. Now it felt like a testament to futures interrupted, walls half-painted, boards stacked in the barn, the echo of silent rooms waiting to be filled. I unlocked the door and flicked on the lights, the yellow bulbs casting long shadows that danced across the wooden floors. I wandered through the rooms, touching the grain of the oak banister, pressing my ear against the drafty windowsills. In each creak, each soft whistle of wind through the broken sash, I heard the whispers of what might have been, weekends painting the sunroom, autumn evenings by the hearth, children's laughter in the yard. My breath caught when I noticed the small oak box from therapy sitting on the mantel. I'd meant to bring it home weeks ago, but had left it behind, thinking I'd be too fragile to face my own confessions in that space. Now, its presence filled the room with unspoken promise. I crossed the threshold and sat on the floor, opened the box, and removed a card I'd written. I'm frightened to live because every day feels undeserved. I read the words aloud, voice echoing in the empty house. Tears blurred my vision as I gently tore the card into pieces and scattered the fragments on the hardwood floor. The pieces glinted in the lamplight like shards of grief, but as I swept them into my hand, they felt lighter, dust rather than lead. I closed the box, stood, and walked to the window overlooking the fields. A lone barn owl called in the distance, and for a moment I felt the pulse of life in the hushed landscape. Over the following weeks, I returned to the farmhouse each evening. I sanded the floors until my muscles ached and the dust coated my skin like a second layer. I painted the walls a warm cream and repaired broken shutters that had hung ajar. With each new nail I hammered and each fresh coat of paint I smoothed, I felt a tether reforming between me and the world I'd feared I no longer belonged to. Meanwhile, at work, I pitched a new project. A community center designed to serve families who had lost loved ones to tragedy. I envisioned a space with quiet reflection rooms, support group offices, and a large common room for gatherings, a place where survivors could find connection and healing. The partners hesitated at first, wary of diverging from our usual commercial developments, but when I shared the story of Flight 845 and the lives lost, they nodded and gave their approval. Walking through the model of the center, a miniature version complete with tiny trees and fixtures, I felt a surge of purpose that eclipsed any doubts. This wasn't just another building, it was a beacon for collective memory, a sanctuary forged from sorrow. In designing it, I was giving shape to my gratitude, carving meaning out of randomness. One Saturday morning, as I finished laying the last brick of the farmhouse's new patio, Mark surprised me with breakfast on the picnic table, a spread of fresh fruit, scrambled eggs, and steaming mugs of coffee. We sat in companionable silence, watching the sun climb above the horizon, painting the sky in soft pastels. "I'm proud of you," he said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. "You've taken something terrible and turned it into something beautiful." I looked out at the fields, then at him, and let myself believe it. The farmhouse no longer felt like a half-finished dream. It was becoming a home. The community center at work was no longer just a blueprint. It was destined to become a place of solace. And I, once a ghost wandering my own life, was breathing deeply again, alive with intention. As the morning breeze stirred the corn tassels, I whispered a promise to the sky. I will live fully in honor of those who cannot. And for the first time since the crash, the words felt true. The late August sun beat down on the vacant lot where the new Community of Remembrance Center was rising from the earth. I stood at the edge of the construction zone, helmet tilted back on my head, watching the crew maneuver steel beams into place. The scent of fresh concrete mingled with the hum of heavy machinery, a symphony of creation that felt both thrilling and fragile. This was more than a building. It was a promise to the families of Flight 845 that their loss would be honored in brick and mortar, in light-filled rooms and quiet alcoves. Beside me, Pastor Williams, whose son, Aaron, had been a passenger on that fateful plane, surveyed the site with guarded hope. His faith had carried him through the darkest months after the crash, and now he lent his gravitas to our joint endeavor. "You've done this beautifully," he said, voice soft as the breeze stirring the pile of white roses at our feet. I smiled, brushing a strand of hair from my face. "It's their story, really, ours. I'm just here to build the vessel." A group of survivors, their faces etched with both grief and resolve, gathered in a rough semicircle. Among them was Captain Elena Vega, the flight attendant who'd survived a mid-air explosion 12 years earlier and devoted her life to aviation safety. She laid a hand on a folded American flag that would be encased in the memorial wall. "We need this," she said, eyes steady, "a place we can go and feel less alone." Behind us, city officials milled about in crisp suits, clipboard in hand. There had been whispers of budget overruns, of skepticism that taxpayers would support a niche community center instead of schools or roads. I'd spent weeks in heated meetings defending the vision, a gathering space not just for those directly affected by Flight 845, but for anyone seeking solace after loss. I believed that grief was universal, and that healing could ripple outward to touch entire neighborhoods. The sound of an approaching car drew our attention. Councilman Richards emerged, flanked by aides. He clasped my hand in a firm, measured grip. "I came to see for myself," he said. "I want to apologize for my earlier doubts. Now I see the need." He gestured toward the survivors. "This will be a beacon." As he walked away, I allowed myself a small exhale of relief. The project was officially green-lit, funding secured to complete not only the memorial garden, but also counseling offices, a children's wing where youngsters could express grief through art, and a public plaza where community gatherings could foster connection. Over the next 4 months, I split my time between the farmhouse renovations and overseeing the center's construction. Each morning, I donned my drafting glasses and pored over blueprints, fine-tuning window placements to maximize afternoon light in the reflection room. Afternoons found me on site, guiding masons as they arranged the rose-colored bricks into the memorial wall, each brick engraved with the name of a passenger. One afternoon, as I stood by the wall with a mason named Raphael, he paused mid-hammer stroke. "Why roses?" he asked. I smiled. "Because white roses symbolize remembrance, and red roses stand for love and respect. Here, they're one, a reminder that memory and affection go hand in hand." Raphael nodded and resumed his work, the gentle tap of his hammer echoing like a heartbeat. By mid-December, the building's exterior was complete, and the first snowfall dusted the site in a lacework of white. We scheduled the grand opening for February 12th, the 31st anniversary of the crash. Invitations went out to survivors, families of the lost, city leaders, and the press. The night before the ceremony, I walked through the empty center. In the reflection room, a circular space with frosted glass walls, I left a single white rose on the central pedestal. In the children's wing, I pressed my palm against the crayon-scrawled walls of the activity alcove, imagining the laughter and tears that would fill the air. In the memorial garden outside, the frozen fountain glistened under moonlight, its water stilled, but poised to flow again come spring. I felt the weight of every life we'd honored, and also the lightness of purpose that had carried me here. The center would stand not only for Flight 845, but for anyone lost in sudden tragedy, a home for stories that demanded to be told. On opening day, I spoke at the podium beneath a pale winter sun. My voice trembled at first. "Today we break ground on healing and build bridges between grief and hope." I gestured to the memorial wall behind me, now lined with 12 granite panels. "Here, every name is a heartbeat remembered." As the ribbon fell and the crowd applauded, I realized that the center had become a living testament to survival's responsibility, to use each new day as an opportunity for compassion and connection. Later, in the warmth of the reception hall, survivors embraced one another and shared stories that laughed and cried in equal measure. I watched Captain Vega talk animatedly with a young widow, and Pastor Williams clasp hands with reporters eager to share the message of hope. In that moment, I understood that the greatest blueprint I'd ever followed was not on paper, but in the human heart, and that by honoring loss, we had indeed built bridges to a more compassionate world. 2 years had passed since the Community of Remembrance Center first opened its doors, and I found myself standing in the stillness of an early spring morning before the world awoke. The memorial garden's tulips and daffodils had burst into bloom, painting the pathways in bursts of gold and crimson. The fountain, once frozen, now sang a gentle song, its water cascading over smooth stone. I stepped onto the gravel path, camera bag slung over my shoulder. Today, I was not in my role as architect or survivor, but as documentarian, preparing to film a short documentary celebrating the center's impact. It was a project I had envisioned ever since the walls had risen. A way to share this place of healing with people who might never set foot here, to remind them that from tragedy can grow beauty, connection, and renewed purpose. My first interviewee was Captain Elena Vega, whose own survival story had inspired the safety protocols now taught in aviation schools nationwide. I found her in the reflection room, the morning light filtering through the frosted windows and wrapping around her like a soft halo. She smiled as I set up the camera tripod. "Ready when you are," she said, her tone warm. "Whenever you film someone here, you feel the history in the air." I nodded. That's what I want, the center's spirit, the sense that memory and hope can coexist. As the camera rolled, Elena spoke of the moment she'd heard about the center's opening. "I was overwhelmed. For years, grief felt like a solitary prison. But here, I found fellowship. I found purpose." She paused, eyes glistening. "Every time I visit, I feel a hand on my shoulder, reminding me I'm not alone." Next, I filmed Pastor Williams in the children's wing, where he oversaw an art therapy session. Tiny hands pressed brightly colored clay into shapes, hearts, stars, letters spelling out names. The children giggled as they worked, their innocent joy a poignant counterpoint to the room's solemn purpose. "Art lets them speak without words," the pastor explained off camera. "They can shape their grief into something tangible." I filmed close-ups of the sculptures, small but precise, then panned across the smiling faces. In the counseling offices, I captured a session, ethically framed, of course, focusing on hands clasped in empathy rather than faces. The counselor's gentle voice merged with the soft tick of the clock, illustrating how these rooms offered a sanctuary where tears could flow without fear of judgment. By midday, I crossed the plaza to where surviving family members had gathered for a support group picnic. I recognized several faces from the original flight manifest: the firefighter's widow, the elderly couple's son, the mother traveling with her 3 children. They passed around handmade quilts stamped with Flight 845's emblem, 12 patches for each chapter of the crash's story, sewn together in love. I approached the quilt's creator, Marisol, a textile artist who had lost her best friend on that flight. "These quilts," she said, wrapping the fabric around her shoulders, "carry warmth and memory. Every stitch is a promise. You are remembered. You are loved." Throughout the day, I wove these interviews and moments into the documentary's narrative. From the center's conception in my heart, through the design and construction phases, to its living presence as a home for grief, healing, and community. I filmed families placing fresh roses at the memorial wall, children reading names aloud, elders finding solace beneath the pergola draped with climbing roses. As the sun dipped low, I set the camera on time-lapse mode to capture the glow of the building's windows against the twilight sky. Inside, lights shone like lanterns of remembrance, and behind those windows, lives continued. Stories unfolding in laughter, in tears, in whispered comforts. When I finally packed up my equipment, I felt a profound sense of closure and of new beginnings. This center, born from tragedy, had become a living testament to resilience. It was more than brick and mortar. It was a vessel carrying the hopes of families, the dedication of volunteers, the compassion of counselors, and the unwavering belief that even in our darkest hours, we could build bridges to connection and light. Driving home along the country road, I reflected on how far we'd come. I thought of the empty bench at Indianapolis Airport, the photograph my in-laws had given me, the spark that ignited this journey. I realized that every life I encountered today, every story I recorded, was a thread in a tapestry woven larger than myself. At home, I uploaded the footage and began editing, knowing that the documentary would reach far beyond our quiet corner of Arkansas. It would carry the message that surviving is a responsibility, to honor the lives lost by living fully, listening deeply, and building spaces where grief and hope could dwell together. That night, as I drifted to sleep, I dreamt of the center's gardens in full bloom, of voices rising in remembrance and song, and I felt for the first time that the legacy of Flight 845 was not only a story of sorrow, but also a story of light, one that would shine for generations to come. The winter chill lingered in the air as I entered the sleek conference center in Washington, D.C. The city's monumental facades loomed just outside the window, a stark contrast to the soft warmth of the meeting room where I was about to address members of Congress. This was a world away from the dusty lot where the Community of Remembrance Center rose from the earth. Yet I felt its heartbeat pulsing in my chest. Today, I would fight not for blueprints or bricks, but for policy, ensuring that no family would ever be abandoned by bureaucracy in the wake of an aviation disaster. I smoothed the lapels of my blazer and inhaled deeply. The room was lined with polished wood panels, and long tables bore nameplates of senators, representatives, and aviation safety advocates. The powerful scent of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the subtle rustle of papers and the low murmur of conversations. Among the attendees sat Captain Elena Vega, her presence a steady anchor, Pastor Williams carrying his son Aaron's memory like a sacred charge, and several surviving family members whose faces I recognized from countless visits to the center. At precisely 10 a.m., the committee chair, Senator Clark, banged the gavel and called the meeting to order. "We are here to consider the Aviation Families Relief and Reporting Enhancement Act," he announced, voice resonant. "Ms. Anderson, you have the floor." I rose, clutching my binder that contained survivor testimonies, psychological studies, and legal analyses. "Thank you, Senator Clark, and esteemed members of the committee," I began, steadying my voice with the same breathing techniques I had taught to families at the center. "My name is Grace Anderson. I speak not only as the founder of the Community of Remembrance Center in Little Rock, Arkansas, but also as someone who survived Flight 845 by a twist of fate." A hush fell over the room. I continued. "In the immediate aftermath of an aviation disaster, families are thrust into a labyrinth of red tape, claims processing, death certificates, legal hearings, while simultaneously grieving. This act proposes 3 critical reforms. Automatic emergency counseling grants. No family should have to apply for care when they need it most. Funds would be disbursed within 48 hours of confirmed loss. Streamlined victim compensation. Establishing a single federal point of contact to coordinate with airlines, insurers, and legal representatives, reducing delays from months to weeks. Mandatory passenger safety debriefings. Every surviving passenger would receive standardized post-incident counseling, medical evaluation, and legal guidance at no cost. As I summarized each point, I saw nods around the table. Captain Vega rose to her feet. "I've spent my career teaching crews to handle emergencies," she said. "But what about passengers? Survivors emerged traumatized, with little support. We owe them more." Pastor Williams followed, his voice gentle but firm. "Families need a clear path forward, a hand to guide them through darkness." When I concluded, the room reverberated with applause. Senator Clark's expression had softened. Even the more skeptical representatives appeared thoughtful. In the ensuing Q&A, I fielded questions about funding sources, proposing a modest surcharge on airline tickets, and about oversight mechanisms, suggesting a joint task force between the Department of Transportation and the Department of Health and Human Services. By the time the hearing ended, several committee members had approached me with gratitude and support. A junior aide handed me a program marking the next steps, markup scheduled for 2 weeks hence, with bipartisan backing. As Captain Vega and Pastor Williams flanked me in the corridor, I felt a surge of exhilaration and the weight of responsibility. This was advocacy in its rawest form, transforming pain into policy that could save lives and kindle hope. That evening, I stood on the balcony of my hotel room, the Potomac River shimmering below. My phone buzzed with messages, uplifting notes from survivors, emails from the center's staff reporting a full day of group sessions, and an invitation to address the International Association of Aviation Psychology next month. I realized that my journey, once defined by architecture, had evolved into a broader mission to reshape the systems that respond to tragedy, ensuring they are guided by compassion as much as by procedure. The following morning, I flew back to Little Rock under a sky so expansive it felt like possibility incarnate. At the airport, I spotted a family with 2 little girls clutching teddy bears, traveling for a weekend getaway. I watched them beam at each other, their laughter light as feathers. I thought of the families who would never again hold such moments, and of the center's role in nurturing those knitted bonds of support. Back at the Remembrance Center, I convened an emergency meeting with our policy team. We drafted letters to state governors, outlining how the federal act would dovetail with local resources. We prepared survivor briefings, updating them on legislative progress. And in a small ceremony, I unveiled a new exhibit in the Memorial Garden, a bronze plaque inscribed with the words, "May our advocacy be the arm that lifts grief toward justice." As I placed a white rose at the foot of the plaque, I thought of the bench photograph my in-laws had given me so many years ago, proof of survival etched in time. But survival was more than a personal miracle. It was a call to action. It was the seed from which a network of compassion could grow, one that extended from a single bench in Indianapolis to the halls of Congress and into the hearts of communities across the nation. And so, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the garden in a gentle glow, I made a vow to keep building, not just buildings or centers, but bridges of policy, empathy, and unwavering support, until every family facing tragedy could stand with steadier hearts. The first light of dawn filtered through the high windows of the Community of Remembrance Center, illuminating dust motes dancing in the quiet foyer. I unlocked the front doors and stepped inside, inhaling the familiar scent of polished wood and fresh flowers. Today marked another milestone, the launch of our Voices United network, a digital platform connecting survivors, families, counselors, and advocates across the country. It was born from a simple realization that healing does not stop at brick and mortar, but thrives wherever hearts choose to share their stories. I settled at the long conference table in the center's administrative wing, where my team, 4 program coordinators, the IT specialist, and the outreach liaison, awaited with caffeinated smiles and freshly printed brochures. The large projector screen glowed with the network's homepage, a mosaic of profile images, each representing a person whose life had been touched by Flight 845 or by other tragedies. Beneath the mosaic, buttons invited visitors to share your story, join a support circle, or access resources. "We go live in 1 hour," I reminded the group, my voice measured but bright. "Let's do one final walkthrough." Maria, our outreach liaison, clicked through the user registration flow. New users can select their role, survivor, family member, counselor, advocate, and be matched to recommended groups based on their needs, she explained. We've also integrated a calendar of events from local meetups to national webinars. Jonathan, the IT specialist, ran a stress test on the server. The slew of successful pings scrolled up on his laptop. "We're stable up to 10,000 concurrent users. Should be plenty for launch day." Across the table, Emily and Raj, our program coordinators, reviewed the first week's schedule. An introductory virtual support circle at noon, a live-streamed panel discussion on navigating post-crash bureaucracy at 3 p.m., and an evening workshop led by Captain Elena Vega on reclaiming safety in the skies. Each event carried the same goal: transform isolation into solidarity, shame into strength. I felt a thrill of pride and the weight of responsibility. The network would live beyond these walls, carrying the center's mission into homes, hospital rooms, and handheld devices. It was a new frontier in our ongoing work, ensuring that no one who needed connection would have to wait for travel or weather or scheduling conflicts to find a listening ear. At precisely 10 a.m., I pressed the Activate button. The homepage refreshed and a banner unfurled across the top. Voices United is now live. Join us in building a network of hope. The team exchanged high fives as the first registration notifications pinged in. Within minutes, the names began pouring in. Longtime members of our local support circles, alongside strangers from distant states. I saw profiles for Joanne H., family member, Texas; Dr. Malik S., counselor, California; and Tanya G., survivor, New York. Each new registration carried its own story, its own thread to weave into our growing tapestry. An hour later, I joined the introductory support circle via webcam. 15 faces filled my screen, some tear-streaked, some tentative, others resolute. I introduced the network's purpose, then asked each participant to share their name, location, and what had brought them here. A young man named Daniel from Ohio spoke first. His voice was soft but steady. "I lost my wife in an aviation accident 2 years ago. I thought I'd moved on, but I still wake up in a panic if my phone rings after 3:20 p.m. His words hung in the air, and I felt a familiar ache. The same fear that had once gripped me, transmuted into courage by the act of speaking aloud. Next, a woman named Patricia from Colorado shared how she'd found solace volunteering at a local hospice, helping others in grief, even as her own wounds remained tender. "Connecting with you all feels like the next step," she said, offering a small, hopeful smile. One by one, the circle unfurled: survivors of crashes, mothers who had buried children, pilots who carried the burden of safety protocols, psychologists researching trauma. When it came to my turn, I spoke of Flight 845 and the bench photograph that had catalyzed my journey. I described the moment my in-laws' laughter, once painful, had become the hinge of my survival, and how that hinge had swung open to reveal a life devoted to others. As the session closed, participants lingered, sending private chat messages of thanks, exchanging contact information, and making plans for one-on-one check-ins. I logged off with a sense of awe. Our modest center had blossomed into a living, breathing network spanning time zones and life experiences. That afternoon, I walked through the memorial garden beneath a sky swirling with late winter clouds. Snowdrops pushed through the mulch, promising spring's return. I paused before the memorial wall, running my fingers over the engraved names, each letter a destination for prayers and remembrances. Beside the wall, I found Pastor Williams kneeling, placing a single white rose at the base of a panel bearing his son's name. He looked up and offered me a quiet nod. "Your network is a bridge," he said. "It connects, it carries, it honors them best by keeping their names alive." I pressed my hand to my heart. "They sent us here to do this work," I whispered, "and we will." That evening, Mark and I sat by the fire in our farmhouse, reviewing the day's analytics. Over 5,000 unique visitors to Voices United, hundreds of new support circles forming, dozens of published personal narratives. We toasted with mugs of hot cocoa, the flames flickering in Mark's warm eyes. "I couldn't be prouder," he said. "You've woven so many threads into something strong and lasting." I smiled against the mug's warmth, thinking of the countless lives now connected by shared grief and hope. The bench photograph lay on the coffee table, always within sight, a reminder of a moment when disappearance became deliverance, despair became determination, and a single life spared became a catalyst for thousands. As the embers glowed and the farmhouse settled into hush, I realized that our work would never truly end. There would always be new voices to welcome, fresh tears to dry, and untold stories waiting for their chance to be heard. But for tonight, I let myself rest in the knowledge that every connection we forged was another step toward a world where no one grieving had to walk alone. The morning sun rose on February 12, 2024, exactly 33 years after Flight 845 vanished from radar. For a moment, I stood at the threshold of the Community of Remembrance Center's main entrance, admiring the sight. A soft carpet of snow on the Memorial Garden's pathways, the rose-colored bricks of the facade warmed by the pale light, and the wreath of white roses hung on the central pergola. Every detail had been arranged for today's ceremony, yet in that stillness before dawn, the space felt timeless, part sanctuary, part living memory. Inside, I found our staff gathered in a semicircle around the hearth in the reception hall, steaming mugs of coffee in hand. We exchanged quiet smiles and nods. This anniversary would be different from all that had come before. Instead of solely memorial services for families, today we would host a Festival of Futures, a day combining remembrance with celebration of lives rebuilt, projects inspired, and connections forged since the center's founding. At precisely 9 a.m., I tapped my glass against a bronze bowl on the hearth's mantel. The bowl chimed with a clear, bell-like resonance that rippled through the room. "Welcome," I began, my voice steady but warm. 33 years ago today, Flight 845's passengers and crew embarked on a journey that would end in tragedy. Nearly 3 decades later, we gather not only to mourn their loss, but to honor their legacy through lives transformed, connections strengthened, and futures reclaimed. I gestured toward the framed photograph of the Indianapolis bench, its image still crisp, its digital timestamp forever frozen at 5:12 p.m. This photograph reminded me how easily laughter can rescue from despair, I continued, how a moment of levity can become the hinge upon which destiny turns. It taught me that surviving isn't merely the absence of death, it is the presence of purpose. Our first event was a garden of wishes, where families and survivors had been invited to write hopes for the coming year on ribbons of white silk and tie them to the pergola's wrought iron roses. I stepped outside into the crisp air, where dozens of silk streamers fluttered like prayer flags in the breeze. Among them, I spotted personal messages. "May my daughter's laughter return," "Strength for the first step without grief," "Guidance for rebuilding our lives." I added my own ribbon. "May every story find its listener." Back indoors, the morning unfolded with a series of short talks. First, Captain Elena Vega spoke about resilience in the face of disaster, not only in the cockpit but in the mind. She described the new aviation training protocols she helped implement, which had been adopted by 3 major airlines and reduced in-flight emergency response times by an average of 12%. Her words brought both pride and tears to many in the audience who remembered her as a young flight attendant, clinging to hope amid chaos. Next, Pastor Williams led a circle of voices, inviting 5 survivors to share how their lives had changed since finding the center. There was Daniel from Ohio, who spoke of discovering a passion for teaching trauma-informed mindfulness workshops to first responders. Patricia from Colorado, whose hospice work had grown into a non-profit that sends art therapy kits to hospitals nationwide. And Marisol, who exhibited an art installation of quilts at the City Museum, each square representing a passenger's story. When she unveiled the installation's final piece, a rose formed from hand-woven threads, there wasn't a dry eye in the hall. At noon, we broke for a communal lunch in the multi-purpose hall. Long tables were draped with white cloths and adorned with centerpieces of red and white roses. As families, survivors, counselors, and policymakers sat together, I moved among them, pausing to listen. I heard laughter from a group of teenage cousins mapping out a charity 5K, tears from an elderly widow sharing memories of her late husband's jokes, and gratitude from a firefighter who credited the center's emergency counseling grants with helping him return to duty. After lunch, we gathered in the hall for the Futures panel, featuring experts in grief psychology, urban design, and legislative advocacy. I moderated the discussion, asking panelists how society could better integrate memorial spaces, digital networks, and policy reform to support those emerging from trauma. Dr. Eleanor Chen, a grief researcher, described promising studies showing that survivors who engaged in community projects, like our center's construction, demonstrated significantly lower rates of depression and complicated grief. Councilman Richards spoke of plans to incorporate remembrance gardens in all new city parks, modeled after ours, while Senator Clark shared that the Aviation Families Relief and Reporting Enhancement Act had cleared committee markup and was scheduled for a full Senate vote next month. As the afternoon light waned, we reconvened outside for the Rose of Reflection ceremony. Under the pergola, each family was invited to place a single red rose, a symbol of love, at the foot of the memorial wall, then share one brief memory aloud. One by one, voices rose. The elderly couple's son spoke of his parents' golden anniversary dance in New Orleans. The firefighter's daughter recalled bedtime stories told in a smoky station kitchen. A young man read from his mother's postcard to her best friend in Paris, a testament to friendships cut short. Each rose laid before the engraved names felt like an offering, a fragile yet enduring bridge between past and present. Finally, as dusk settled, we processed into the reflection room for the Candle of Remembrance ritual. Dimmed lights and a circular arrangement of flickering candles set a hushed, reverent atmosphere. I held a single taper, lit from the hearth's eternal flame, and passed it to the next person, each attendee lighting their own candle before placing it in the center's bowl. When every candle glowed, the room pulsed with gentle light, illuminating faces etched with grief, resilience, and hope. I stepped forward and spoke softly. May these candles remind us that memory and hope can shine brightest in darkness. May we carry this light out into our lives, honoring those we lost by living fully, loving deeply, and building bridges of compassion wherever we go. As candles flickered, tears and smiles intertwined. The weight of 33 winters of loss felt shared in that warm glow. And as I looked around at the circle of faces, young and old, near and far, I understood that the center's legacy was not confined to its walls, its gardens, or its policies. Its true legacy lived in each heart that chose to remember, to rebuild, and to keep the flame burning. That night, as advisors and volunteers gathered in the hall to stow decorations and share a final cup of cocoa, I slipped away to the memorial garden one last time. Beneath the pergola, the silk ribbons whispered in the cold breeze. I touched the engraved names on the wall, each letter a testament to lives that had become beacons. "I will carry you forward," I whispered, placing one last white rose at the base. With the anniversary behind us, I knew the work would continue, in new chapters, new projects, new stories. But for now, in the hush of the snowfall and the glow of memory, I felt profoundly grateful. For survival, for purpose, and for every life woven into this tapestry of light and shadow. The first rays of summer sunlight spilled across the rolling fields as I loaded my suitcase into the trunk of Mark's car. Today, I was embarking on a journey I had dreamed of ever since the Community of Remembrance Center opened its doors. An international delegation to share our model of healing, advocacy, and community building with colleagues in Europe and Asia. My itinerary spanned 6 countries in 8 days: England, Germany, Italy, Sweden, Japan, and Singapore. The prospect thrilled me, but beneath the excitement lay a quiet tremor of nerves. Could our small center in Arkansas truly inspire change on a global scale? Mark pressed a kiss to my temple and handed me a stack of briefing folders. "You'll do great," he said. "You carry all our stories with you." I squeezed his hand, drawing strength from the warmth of home before closing the car door and heading off toward the airport. London, United Kingdom. My first stop was the British Memorial Trust's annual conference in London. In a historic lecture hall near Hyde Park, I stood before an audience of architects, policymakers, and grief counselors. Behind me, a slideshow displayed images of our memorial garden's pergola, the reflection room's frosted glass, and smiling faces gathered in support circles. I spoke of Flight 845's bench photograph, the moment when laughter became salvation, and how it had catalyzed a movement of remembrance and resilience. After my keynote, a question and answer session opened. A distinguished architect asked, "How do you balance aesthetic beauty with functional necessity in a space meant for mourning?" I described our design principles: soft, natural materials to comfort the body, ample daylight to soothe the mind, and flexible spaces that welcome both silence and shared stories. As the discussion wound down, a representative from the Imperial War Museum approached me. "We'd like to collaborate on a similar center for veterans and their families," he said. "Your model resonates far beyond aviation tragedies." I felt a thrill. Our work truly had universal reach. Berlin, Germany. Next came a workshop in Berlin with civic planners focused on cities of memory. In a restored industrial loft, I joined local historians and urban designers in mapping sites of remembrance across the city, from the Holocaust Memorial to the Soviet War Memorial. I presented our Voices United network as a digital companion to physical spaces, allowing survivors and families to connect regardless of geography. The German colleagues shared insights on memorial plaques in public squares and proposed integrating our digital platform with historical archives. Over coffee and Black Forest cake, we sketched plans for a pilot project linking Berlin's memorial sites with an online support portal, a fusion of past and present, brick and bandwidth. Milan, Italy. In Milan, I visited the Politecnico's Department of Design, where graduate students were developing interactive installations for remembrance museums. I guided them through our reflection room's concept and encouraged them to incorporate user-generated stories. One team proposed a story vine, a living sculpture of wires and lights that participants could add to, representing the growth of collective memory. That evening, over risotto and prosecco, we toasted new ideas. A cross-pollination of art, architecture, and empathy that could redefine how cultures honor loss. Stockholm, Sweden. At a Nordic symposium on healing through nature, I traveled to Stockholm to explore biophilic design. Surrounded by pine forests and glass-walled conference pavilions, I learned how Scandinavian architects seamlessly blend interior spaces with the outdoors. Inspired, I proposed adding vertical gardens and seasonal plantings to our center's memorial garden, creating ever-changing tapestries of growth. Swedish delegates shared research showing that green spaces accelerate emotional recovery. I imagined our pergola draped in ivy, the scent of jasmine perfuming reflection room windows, a living testament to renewal. Tokyo, Japan. Halfway around the world, Tokyo greeted me with neon nights and tranquil temples. I met with the Japan Society for Grief Studies and toured the Sendai Mediation Center, a space dedicated to tsunami survivors. Their approach blended traditional Japanese healing rituals, tea ceremonies, calligraphy workshops, with modern counseling. I marveled at their floating lotus installation, a pond of illuminated lotuses, each inscribed with a message from someone who had lost a loved one. We discussed adding a water feature to our reflection room, gentle trickles to underscore the flow of memory. As I bowed in gratitude, I felt our innovations weaving across continents. Singapore. My final stop was Singapore's Future of Healing Summit, held in a gleaming waterfront convention center. I presented our policy achievements, the emergency counseling grants, the federal victim compensation reform, and urged delegates to adopt similar frameworks. Representatives from the Ministry of Social and Family Development expressed keen interest. They spoke of disaster relief protocols that lacked consistent mental health support, a gap our act had closed. Before leaving, I signed a memorandum for a pilot counseling grant program funded by Singapore's aviation regulator. On my return flight, I gazed down at the endless expanse of clouds, reflecting on 8 whirlwind days of collaboration. Each conversation had enriched our own practices and sown seeds for new centers, networks, and policies worldwide. The bench photograph lay in my carry-on pocket, its memory still potent, proof that survival could ripple outward into a tide of hope. When I finally hugged Mark in the arrivals hall, I felt both exhausted and exhilarated. Our farmhouse, the Community of Remembrance Center, and the Voices United network were no longer local endeavors. They had become part of a global tapestry of remembrance and resilience. That night, in the comfort of home, I penned a new chapter in our story, an outline for an International Remembrance Alliance, a consortium of organizations dedicated to creating spaces, digital platforms, and policies that support survivors and honor the lost. As I drifted to sleep, the last thought echoing in my mind was a simple promise: to keep expanding horizons of hope, ensuring that no matter where tragedy struck, there would always be a place, physical, digital, or legislative, where grief found compassion and memory found purpose. The first light of morning glinted through the large windows of my home office, illuminating the stack of letters and emails that had accumulated during my travels. Each missive was a testament to the far-reaching impact of the Community of Remembrance Center and the Voices United network. Requests for blueprints, invitations to consult on new memorial projects, notes from survivors in Australia and Brazil, sharing how our digital platform guided them to local support. I settled into my desk chair, heart swelling with gratitude and a renewed sense of purpose. Today would be dedicated to synthesizing these global conversations into an actionable roadmap for the International Remembrance Alliance. I spent the morning reviewing video transcripts from the London conference, workshop notes from Berlin, and design sketches from Milan. By midday, I drafted a framework outlining 3 core pillars for the Alliance: global standards for healing spaces, architectural guidelines, emphasizing universal principles, natural light, biophilic integration, flexible communal areas, while allowing for cultural adaptations, a certification process for centers that meet criteria in accessibility, sustainability, and therapeutic design, digital network integration, an expanded Voices United platform supporting multilingual interfaces, real-time translation, and regional resource directories, APIs enabling local centers to embed support groups, counseling portals, and event calendars directly into their own websites or apps, policy and advocacy collaboration, a shared repository of legislative templates like the Emergency Counseling Grants Act, adapted to different legal systems. Annual summits bringing together policymakers, mental health experts, and survivors to update best practices and launch joint initiatives. As the afternoon light shifted, I took a break to walk through the farmhouse gardens with Mark. The hydrangeas and lilies were in full bloom, their vibrant hues a living mosaic of life's renewal. We paused by the small bench beneath the maple tree, the very spot where I first conceived the idea of building bridges from grief. Mark slipped his arm through mine and smiled. "You've woven so many threads into this tapestry of hope," he said, "and now you're passing the needle to others around the world." His words filled me with both humility and resolve. Back in my office, I polished the draft Alliance Charter and circulated it to our core leadership team for feedback. Within hours, insightful annotations arrived, suggestions for including indigenous healing practices, concerns about data privacy for survivors in restrictive countries, and ideas for scholarship funds enabling staff from resource-limited regions to attend Alliance summits. That evening, I convened a video call with Captain Elena Vega, Pastor Williams, and our policy director, Miriam Chen. We spoke for 2 hours, weaving together personal stories with strategic vision. Captain Vega emphasized the importance of frontline voices. Survivors and first responders must guide these efforts. We know what it feels like to navigate a world that's suddenly broken. Pastor Williams reflected on the power of ritual and ceremony across cultures. Whether it's lighting candles in Arkansas or draping flowers at a Japanese shrine, we tap into shared humanity. Miriam underscored the urgency of safeguarding digital privacy and ensuring culturally competent counseling resources. By the time the call ended, we had a comprehensive plan and the excitement of a team ready to mobilize. I drafted a press release announcing the launch of the International Remembrance Alliance, inviting member organizations, museums, healing centers, mental health NGOs, architectural firms to join a founding council. I scheduled the inaugural summit for 9 months ahead in Little Rock, a symbolic gesture to inaugurate our global collaboration on the soil where this journey began. Over the next week, I coordinated with graphic designers to develop a visual identity for the Alliance, a stylized compass, rose entwined with a white rose, symbolizing guidance and remembrance. I liaised with translators to prepare Alliance materials in 8 languages, and I reached out to major philanthropic foundations for seed funding, sharing analytics on Voices United's reach, over 200,000 registered users across 72 countries, and testimonials from survivors whose lives had been reshaped through connection. On the morning of the official announcement, I stood before the memorial wall in the Community of Remembrance Center, the engraved names glinting in the sunlight. I drew a deep breath and placed my hand on the central granite panel. "From this wall," I said softly, "we launch a network of hearts, bound together in compassion, guided by memory, and committed to honoring every life through spaces, policies, and platforms that heal." As cameras flashed and live stream audiences tuned in from Seoul to São Paulo, I felt the continuum of compassion stretch outward, a living legacy born from a narrow escape at an Indianapolis gate, nurtured through bricks and mortar, code and counsel, policy and partnership. In that moment, I understood that the story of Flight 845 had transcended tragedy. It had become a catalyst for global solidarity, a reminder that survival is not an endpoint, but a beginning, the first step in a lifelong journey of remembrance, empathy, and action. And as the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows behind the memorial wall, I smiled, knowing that this chapter too was an invitation to every builder of healing spaces, every digital connector of lonely hearts, and every advocate for just policy, to join together across borders and cultures in a shared mission to keep memory alive, support those in sorrow, and kindle hope for generations yet unborn.